They laughed, all of them. And I just stood there holding my wine glass thinking, well, this is it then. My name is Frank. Frank Calloway. No, wait, that one's taken. Frank Beaumont. 64 years old. Retired civil engineer. I spent 31 years building bridges across this country. Literal ones. The kind that hold up under ice and weight and time. Turns out I wasn't as good at the other kind. My daughter's name is Vivian. My son-in-law's name is Derek, and Ms. Owen, no. His name is Curtis. Curtis Price. And the night of my 70th birthday party, wait, I was 68, let me get this right. Because the details matter, the night of my 68th birthday at the Fairmont in downtown Ottawa, with 43 people seated at round tables with white linen and little candles in glass holders. Curtis stood up and tapped his fork against his champagne flute and said he had an announcement to make. I remember thinking he was going to say Vivian was pregnant. They'd been trying. I remember hoping that was it. It wasn't that. Let me back up. Let me go all the way back, because that's the only way any of this makes sense. My wife, Vivian's mother, passed 11 years ago. Breast cancer. Her name was June, and she was the kind of woman who remembered everyone's coffee order and kept a running grocery list on the side of the fridge with a magnet shaped like a covered bridge. When she died, I was 53 years old and I didn't know how to operate the dishwasher. I'm serious. We'd had that machine for 7 years and I had never once run a cycle. June did it. June did most things in that quiet, efficient way she had, where you didn't even notice until it wasn't being done anymore. Vivian was 26 when her mother died. She came home from Vancouver to help me get settled, and she never really stopped helping after that. She'd call every Sunday. She'd come at Christmas and Easter. When I retired 4 years later, she started calling twice a week, asking about my diet, my doctor's appointments, whether I was getting out of the house enough. I thought that was love, and it was, at the beginning. I genuinely believed that. But somewhere along the way, and I can't point to an exact moment, more like a slow drift, the way a fence line moves a few inches every year until the field isn't yours anymore. Somewhere along the way, the phone calls stopped being about how I was doing and started being about what I could do for them. The first ask was reasonable. Curtis had a business idea, something about importing kitchen equipment for restaurant supply chains. He'd done his research, had a solid plan on paper. He needed startup capital, $40,000. I had it. I was comfortable. June and I had always been careful people. I said yes. The second ask came 18 months later. The business wasn't performing the way Curtis had projected. He needed a bridge loan, his word, bridge loan, and I remember thinking, well, at least he speaks my language. $30,000 this time. I gave it. The third ask was the one that should have made me stop. They'd bought a house in the Glebe. Beautiful neighborhood, old trees, close to the Rideau River. But the house needed work, the mortgage was stretched, and they just wondered if I might consider co-signing on a home equity line of credit. Not giving money, just lending my name, my credit, my signature. I sat with that one for a week. I talked to my friend, a man I've known since university, a retired chartered accountant who has a habit of saying the thing no one else will say. He said, Frank, once you co-sign, you're not their father anymore. You're their balance sheet. I signed anyway. Vivian called it the nicest thing I'd ever done for her. That was 3 years before the birthday party. In those 3 years, things changed. Not all at once, not dramatically. More like the weather shifting from September into October. You don't notice until one morning you reach for your jacket without thinking about it. Curtis stopped coming on the phone when Vivienne called. Then Vivienne started calling less. The Sunday calls became every other week, then monthly, then I was the one initiating. When I visited Ottawa, I'd moved back to Barrie by then, back to the house June and I had bought in 1989. When I visited, there was always something slightly off. A meal that felt like an obligation. A conversation where I could feel them waiting for me to leave so they could talk about something else. My granddaughter was born 2 years before the birthday party. Her name is Maisie. And I want to be honest here, because this whole account only means something if I'm honest. Maisie was the reason I kept going. She was the reason I kept signing the checks and showing up and pretending not to notice the way Curtis looked at me sometimes, like I was a piece of furniture he'd inherited, but didn't like the style of. I babysat Maisie on Thursdays. That was the arrangement. Vivian was back at work. Curtis was running his business, which was doing better now, had been doing better since the second infusion of money, and I would drive down from Barrie on Thursday mornings and spend the day with my granddaughter. Those Thursdays were the best days I had in those years. Maisie had June's eyes. She liked stacking things and knocking them over and stacking them again, and she laughed at the same knock-knock jokes 4 times in a row without getting tired of them. She called me Grandpa Frankie. June would have loved that. I kept showing up every Thursday because of Maisie, and because I think I kept hoping the other thing, the distance, the transactional feeling, would fix itself. It didn't. 6 months before my 68th birthday, Vivian called on a Tuesday, which was unusual. I remember I was making soup, a chicken and wild rice thing I'd been slowly getting better at. She didn't ask how I was. She said she wanted to talk about the birthday. She wanted to throw me a party. Big one. The Fairmont, 40 or 50 people, proper dinner service. She sounded genuinely excited, and I felt something open back up in my chest that I hadn't realized had closed. I said yes, of course. I said it sounded wonderful. Over the next few months, she'd send me updates. The venue was booked. The menu was set. Roast beef with a Dijon crust, twice-baked potatoes, green bean almandine. My old colleagues were invited, people I'd worked with on the Trans-Canada Bridge projects. My friend from university, the accountant, was coming. A few neighbors, some cousins from my side. I started looking forward to it. I started thinking maybe I'd been wrong about the drift. Maybe this was Vivian's way of course-correcting, of saying she knew she'd been distant and this was how she was fixing it. The week of the party, I drove down from Barrie on the Wednesday. Vivian and Curtis had the spare room set up for me, fresh towels, a little dish of the mince I like, the kind with the soft centers. I thought, see, they do know me. They do. Thursday, I looked after Maisie. Friday, Vivian and I went for lunch, just the two of us, at a Thai place on Elgin Street. She seemed warm, she laughed at things. She asked about my knee, which had been giving me trouble. Saturday was the party. I wore the suit June had picked out for our 40th anniversary dinner. Navy blue, subtle gray stripe. I'd had it let out once since then, but it still fit right through the shoulders. I wore her favorite tie of mine, a dark burgundy silk one I'd bought in Montreal the year Vivian was born. I looked in the mirror before I left the hotel room. Vivian had insisted I stay at the Fairmont proper. In one of the rooms, it would be easier than driving back to their place. And I thought, 68 years old, still standing, not bad, Frank. The party started at 7. By 7:30, the room was full and I was doing what I've always done at large gatherings, which is move from table to table and find something genuine to say to each person. My old bridge colleague from the Manitoba projects was there. 3 of my cousins. My accountant friend who'd driven up from Kingston and who found me early and said, "You look good, Frank. What's your secret?" I said, "Soup." He laughed. By 8:30, we'd had the first course. Wine was flowing. The speeches started. A few of my colleagues said kind things about the work, about the projects we'd built together. My accountant friend told the story about the time I'd miscalculated a load rating and had to rerun every number from scratch at 2 in the morning before the client review, and how I'd come in the next day having not slept and presented the revised numbers so calmly that no one knew anything had happened. He said that was the most Frank Beaumont thing he'd ever seen. I felt full of something warm and good. I thought, this is it, this is what it was supposed to be. Then Curtis stood up. He tapped his glass. The room quieted. He smiled the smile he has, wide, easy, the kind of smile that makes you trust someone before you have any reason to. He said he wanted to take a moment to say something on behalf of himself and Vivian. He said that when you have a father like Frank Beaumont, a man who gave you everything you needed to build a life, and here he paused, let it land, you realize at some point that it's time to stand on your own 2 feet, that it's time to stop accepting gifts you hadn't fully earned. I thought he was building to a thank you. I thought this was the preamble to something generous. He said that he and Vivian had spent the last year talking about what it meant to have a healthy, adult relationship with a parent. That they'd been doing some reading, he actually said reading, about financial enmeshment and emotional boundaries. He said they'd come to understand that the dynamic between our family and me had become, quote, codependent in ways that weren't serving anyone. He said they were drawing a new line. He said they would be removing me as co-signer on the home equity line of credit. Their lawyer had already handled the paperwork. He said they would not be repaying the $70,000 as they considered it, in consultation with a financial therapist, to be compensation for my, quote, emotional reliance on Vivian and the toll that had placed on their marriage. He said they felt it was healthiest going forward to limit contact to major holidays and the occasional supervised visit with Maisie. He sat down. The room was very quiet. Vivian was looking at the tablecloth. Someone coughed. And then Curtis raised his glass and said, "To Frank on his 68th birthday." And 3 or 4 people at their table, his friends, his business contacts, people I'd met once at Christmas, they raised their glasses too. I sat with my hands in my lap, and I thought of June. I thought June would have known what to say right now. June would have had the words. I don't have them. So I did the thing I've learned to do when I don't have words. I smiled. I nodded slowly and I said, "Well, thank you for that, Curtis." He looked surprised. He'd expected tears maybe, or anger. I picked up my wine glass. I took a sip. I turned to my colleague on my left and I asked him how the Pemberton Street overpass project was coming along. The party continued. I stayed for all of it. I ate the roast beef. I thanked the staff. I said goodnight to everyone personally, by name. And on the elevator up to my room, alone I called my accountant friend. He answered on the second ring. I said, I need you to come up here first thing in the morning. Bring your reading glasses, he said. I'll be there at 7. Here is what Curtis didn't know. When June died, I didn't just inherit grief. I inherited the estate she had quietly, carefully been building for 30 years. June had been a trust and estate paralegal. She understood instruments that most people never think about until it's too late. Before she got sick, before she was even diagnosed, when it was just a lump she was waiting to hear back about. She sat down with our lawyer and built a structure around our assets that I didn't fully understand at the time, but that she walked me through patiently over several evenings with a legal pad and a cup of tea. The house in Barrie was held in a family trust. The investments were in a separate holding structure. The liquid assets, savings, the RSP I'd rolled into a RIF at retirement, those were in my name, but they represented less than 30% of the total picture. The $70,000 I'd given Curtis and Vivian came from those liquid accounts, discretionary gifts, documented. The co-signing on the home equity line. Curtis's lawyer had indeed removed me. What Curtis's lawyer apparently hadn't noticed, or hadn't thought to ask about, was that the original mortgage on the Glebe house had a co-borrower clause tied to a personal guarantee I'd provided 3 years ago, separate from the HELOC, at the time of purchase. Getting off the HELOC didn't touch the guarantee, and the guarantee had a cross-default provision. I didn't know what a cross-default provision was when June explained it to me. She said, Frank, it means if they ever default on anything connected to this guarantee, everything comes back to you, and you get to decide what to do with that. She'd said it like it was a burden. I was starting to understand it differently. My accountant friend arrived at 7:03. I had coffee made. He sat down across from me at the small hotel room desk, and I spread out the papers I'd brought. I always travel with the important papers, June's habit adopted out of grief and kept out of wisdom, and I said, walk me through what I have here. He was quiet for a long time. He read carefully, the way he always does, moving his lips just slightly. Then he set the papers down and looked at me. He said, Frank, did Curtis know about the personal guarantee? I said his lawyer handled the whole thing. I signed what they sent me. He was quiet again. He said, Curtis's mortgage, did he refinance in the last 2 years? I said, I believe so. He mentioned it once. Said he'd gotten a better rate. My friend pulled out his phone. He made a call. He spoke in a low voice for about 4 minutes. When he hung up, he looked at me in a way that I recognized, the same look he used to give me across a conference table when a project review was about to go very differently than the client expected. He said, when they refinanced, they didn't discharge the personal guarantee. It's still registered. They either didn't know it was there, or their lawyer missed it. I said, what does that mean for me? He said, it means the relationship you have with this mortgage is more substantial than any of the paperwork Curtis presented last night would suggest. I poured us both more coffee. I said, and if I were to contact the lender directly? He said, you'd be doing something I'd strongly advise having a lawyer present for. But theoretically, you'd be the first call they'd make if anything went sideways with that mortgage. And the lender would want to know why the co-borrower arrangement wasn't disclosed in the refinancing documents. I said, is there a lawyer you'd recommend? He smiled. He said, I know a woman in Ottawa, estate and property, quiet, very good. I did not do anything rash. I want to make that clear. I'm not a rash person. I've never been a rash person. I've spent my career doing precise calculations before making moves that other people would feel, and I approached this the same way. The lawyer, her name was Margaret, I'll call her that, met me on Monday morning. She reviewed everything over 2 days. On Wednesday, she called and said, Mr. Beaumont, I want to be very careful about how I explain this, but you have standing here that Curtis and Vivian are not currently aware of. She said, I want to recommend we do nothing immediately. I want to recommend you go home, resume your routine, and let me monitor the situation. Specifically, I want to see how the mortgage is being serviced over the next 2 quarters. I said, and if there's a missed payment? She said, then we'll have a conversation about your options. I went home. I resumed my routine. I made soup. I shoveled my walk. In February, there was a February storm, the kind that reminds you why you live in Ontario, and also why you keep asking yourself why you live in Ontario. And I cleared my driveway twice in one day and felt genuinely satisfied. Vivian called in December. It was brief. She asked if I was planning to come for Christmas. I said I had plans with my cousins in Sudbury. She said okay. That was most of the call. I asked to speak to Maisie. She put her on for 3 minutes. Maisie told me she'd learned to do a cartwheel. I said that was one of the best things I'd ever heard. Spring came. Margaret called in April. She said, there was a missed payment in March. They caught it up, but it was 30 days late. And there's a second issue. Curtis appears to have taken out an equipment loan against one of his business assets. That asset was listed in the original personal guarantee as collateral. She said, Mr. Beaumont, I think it's time. I asked her what she wanted to do. She said, I'd like to notify the lender about the unresolved guarantee and the potential collateral conflict. I'd also like to send a letter to Curtis and Vivian's lawyer advising them that you're aware of the situation and are reviewing your options. Not threatening, informational, but very clear. I said do it. The call came from Vivian on a Thursday. I was in the car on my way down to Ottawa. I had a standing appointment, had reinstated it quietly, to see Maisie. Vivian didn't know. I'd arranged it through Vivian's next-door neighbor, a woman I'd gotten to know over the years of Thursday babysitting. She'd let me pick Maisie up from her place, since Maisie was dropped there on the days Vivian worked from home and needed quiet. That's a longer story. The point is, I was in the car when Vivian called. She didn't say hello. She said, "Dad, what is happening?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Curtis got a letter from a lawyer. Something about the mortgage, something about a guarantee. He's really upset, Dad. He's saying you're trying to take the house." I said, "I'm not trying to take anything, Vivian." She said, "Then what is this?" I said, "It's information. The lawyer is making sure everyone is aware of the legal situation, which apparently wasn't fully disclosed when you refinanced." She said, "We didn't know about any guarantee." I said, "That's something to take up with your lawyer." Silence on the line. She said, "Dad, are you doing this because of the party?" I took a breath. I watched the 400 highway open up ahead of me, the tree line thick on both sides, the sky doing that white April thing it does before it decides to be blue. I said, "Vivian, I'm doing this because your husband made certain decisions about our financial relationship without understanding it fully. I'm making sure it's understood fully now. That's all." She said, "Can we meet?" I said, "I'll be in Ottawa in about 40 minutes. I was planning to see Maisie." Very long pause. She said, "I didn't know you were still seeing her." I said, "Yes." Another pause. Then quietly, "Okay, come to the house." We sat in the kitchen. Curtis wasn't there. Vivian said he'd gone for a walk, which I understood to mean he needed to not be in the room for this. There was coffee. Maisie was in the living room watching something with animated dogs. Vivian looked tired. She had June's coloring, and when she was tired she had June's way of holding her mouth. She said, "I didn't know it would go like that." The party. Curtis had the outline, but I didn't know exactly what he was going to say. I said, "But you knew something was coming." She looked at the table. I said, "Vivian, I'm not angry, I want you to know that. I was that night a little, but I'm not now. I need you to understand some things about where we are." She said, "Okay." I said, "I have never used money to control you. When I gave you and Curtis the money, I gave it, no strings. The co-signing was the same. I didn't do those things so I could hold them over you. I did them because I thought that's what fathers do, because your mother would have done the same thing." Vivian's eyes got bright. She looked out the kitchen window. I said, "But when Curtis stood up at my birthday and told 43 people that I was emotionally codependent, and that the money was compensation for damage I'd caused, Vivian, that's not a boundary. That's a humiliation. And it was built on a misunderstanding of our legal relationship that I should have clarified much earlier. I'm clarifying it now," she said. "What does that mean for the house?" I said, "It means nothing is going to happen to the house if the mortgage is being serviced properly and the collateral situation gets cleaned up. Margaret, my lawyer, she'll work with your lawyer to document everything correctly. It's an administrative thing, it doesn't need to be a crisis." Vivian said, "Curtis thinks you're going to take it." I said, "I know. That's because Curtis doesn't understand what I actually want, which is nothing to do with the house." She said, "Then what do you want?" I took a sip of coffee. I looked into the living room where Maisie was laughing at a dog cartoon. I said, "I want my Thursday afternoons back." Vivian started crying, quietly the way her mother cried, which was barely any sound at all, just the face doing things the voice doesn't. I didn't rush it. I waited. After a while she said, "Okay." I said, "And I want you to tell Curtis that if he'd like to have a conversation with me, a real one, not a speech, I'm available for that. Man to man, no lawyers in the room." She nodded. I said, "And I would like to stop being treated like a problem you're managing and start being treated like your father again. That's the full list." She wiped her face. She said, "That's not a very long list." I said, "I'm a simple man." Curtis came home. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and he had the face of someone who has spent the last few hours rehearsing and now couldn't remember his lines. He's not a bad man. I've never thought he was a bad man. I think he's a man who got very comfortable with a certain version of reality and got surprised when that reality turned out to be more complicated than he knew. He said, "I think I made some mistakes." I said, "I think we both could have handled things differently." He said, "The guarantee, I genuinely didn't know." I said, "I know. That's what happens when people assume they understand an arrangement they haven't actually read in full." He held my eye on that. He understood what I meant. He said, "What do you need from me?" I said, "The same thing I told your wife. Thursdays with Maisie. A real relationship, not a managed one. And when the lawyers have sorted out the paperwork, I want us to have dinner. Here or out, I don't care. And I want no one to make a speech." He laughed. It surprised him, I think, the laughing. He covered it quickly. He said, "Fair enough." I said, "Curtis, I'm not your enemy. I'm Maisie's grandfather. I'd rather we figured that out now than in 15 years when she's old enough to understand what happened. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's fair." We shook hands. It wasn't warm, not yet. But it was a beginning. I'm writing this from the porch of my house in Barrie, on a Saturday in late September, with a cup of coffee and the kind of morning that makes you believe everything in Ontario is going to be all right. The maples are doing what they do. The street is quiet. The neighbor's dog is wandering along the sidewalk with that particular senior dog dignity. Margaret's paperwork is filed. The guarantee situation has been resolved properly. Everything documented. No surprises left. The mortgage is current. Maisie has been coming to Barrie on occasional weekends now. Vivian drops her off Friday evening and picks her up Sunday. This was Maisie's idea. She asked her mother if she could have a sleepover at Grandpa Frankie's house, and Vivian said yes. We made pancakes the first morning. Maisie wanted them shaped like dogs because of the cartoon. I did my best. They looked more like mittens than dogs, but she ate 3 of them and declared them the best pancakes she'd ever had, which I suspect was generosity more than accuracy, but I'll take it. I called my accountant friend last week. We're going to Sudbury in October for the fall colors. It's become a tradition the last few years. I said, I'll drive. He said, you always drive, Frank. I said, I know. That's because you drive like someone who's never been on a highway that freezes. He laughed. He said, how are things with Vivian? I said, better. Careful. But better. He said, and Curtis? I said, I think Curtis is figuring out that I'm harder to write off than he thought. Which when I think about it might just be the nicest thing anyone said about me all year. He said, June would have loved to see this. I said, yeah, she would have. I put the phone down and I sat there for a minute with that. Just let it sit. Then I went inside and started the soup.